Hi, everybody. This is Francisco Gil-White from Management of Reality. And just to let you know, we're going to be having from now on live in English on our English YouTube channel every week. And today we have Eric Heinze, who is at the University of London. He directs the Center for Law and Democracy there. And he's got some interesting stuff to talk about on the question of anti-Semitism and the importance of Russia in anti-Semitism. And also, he's been working on the question of human rights and the effect that the media have on human rights discourse and how that affects the way this is discussed and in fact materially affects human rights. So we're going to talk a little bit about those two topics with him. Eric, why don't you present yourself a little bit more and you tell us what you're doing, stuff that I don't know and that people might be interested in.
Well, Francisco, thank you very, very much for having me on your show. It's a pleasure to be with you. Yes, as you were saying, I'm a professor of law and humanities at Queen Mary, University of London. It's one of the colleges of the University of London. And I've, for a long time, written, published, researched in a number of areas, including human rights, free speech, historical memory, how that translates into law. And my most recent book is called Coming Clean, The Rise of Critical Theory and the Future of the Left. One of the things I tried to do, that really just came out last month with the MIT Press. And one of the things I tried to do in that book is look at what has always been one of the most important features of contemporary leftism, and I mean going back more than 100 years, which is the idea that progressive thought always comes out of self-criticism, out of collective self-criticism, indeed as the basis for insisting that the rest of society needs to do collective self-criticism. And one of the things I show in the book is that in recent decades, progressives have been very good at that second bit, right? Ensuring that the rest of us should do collective self-criticism of kind of, and legitimately so, of, many horrors of Western civilization, but that this has no longer come out of a place of the left's own critical self-understanding. Many people on the left do actually believe, they sincerely believe, that they engage in collective self-criticism. And one of the things I show in the book is it's entirely absent, and that the left won't progress, progressives won't progress unless they really confront this enormous gap, right? I mean, Francisco, I know that you have some familiarity with the United States, and you probably know that since Trump was reelected, there have been endless conversations. Well, where did the left go wrong? Where have Democrats gone wrong? And it's always done very much at the service, right? We need to talk a little bit less about this issue and a little bit more about that issue, and not so much about trans athletes in women's sports and these. And one of the things I'm trying to say in this book is it goes much deeper and much further back.
Okay, so one question about that, Eric.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. So when you say collective self-criticism, that's sort of a label for what leftists now do, which is they just blame the Western civilization for everything they don't like. It seems to me they don't critically examine themselves, as you're saying. What they do is just say the West is bad, and it seems to me that they also pretend that everything that is not the West is good. And there's hardly any analysis there. It's just West bad, not West good. And they keep sort of rehashing the crimes of the past in the West without really recognizing that the West has changed. And that it's a better place than it used to be.
Yeah. I think it very often comes across this way. If you probe enough, you'll have plenty of people on the left who saying, "Oh yes, of course, terrible things in China and terrible things in Iran." And so I'm not sure that it would be true to say that the left glorifies everything that's non-Western, although I understand how it comes across that way. And I think the reason it comes across that way is, again, we could come up with so many examples. Let's take the example of the Ukraine war. I know we'll get back to anti-Semitism, but this might be a good warm-up because actually it's very related, which is that, again, if you look at a lot of progressives writing, people like Noam Chomsky, Judith Butler, Slavoj Žižek, a number of people, they've intervened actually often frequently on the question of Ukraine. They say, "Oh yes, terrible. What Putin did was terrible." And then much of the analysis, particularly with someone like Chomsky, is everything the West has done wrong, right? In other words, what we don't get from them, or even people like Judith Butler or Slavoj Žižek, who criticize Putin in greater detail, what we never get is the fact that important strands of the left itself for more than 100 years were deeply implicated in this regime. Now, if it were true that progressives start from a place of collective self-criticism, this would be the first thing you would be hearing on college campuses over the last few years since the invasion of 2022. That would be mobilizing protests, demonstrations. Where have they been?
So, but what is it that we were hearing?
And if we haven't seen a single one, and we really haven't, what does collective self-critique mean? And so this is what I'm saying. So this is what I think explains the phenomenon you're talking about, is that, right, as you say, it's always about all the Western wrongdoing, and that's fine, that's good. The West has done things which we need to talk about seriously. But what happens is that we're taught to do collective self-criticism by people who don't do it.
But even in the case where criticism of the West is legitimate,
yeah,
it seems to me that it's entirely tendentious. So for example, take the question of slavery. So people will say, well, the West was bad because it participated in slavery, and that was terrible. And of course, I agree with that. But they never acknowledge that slavery was common in other societies as well, nor do they seem to think it's important that Westerners themselves abolished slavery. So, I mean, if the West abolished slavery and slavery is no longer legal in the West, and we all think it's bad, why do you have to keep beating up the West because it was once part of slavery? I mean, why does it not end? I don't understand.
Yeah, and here's my take. Because I see the problem. I think we agree on the problem, but we would maybe explain it a bit differently. So let me tell you how I would approach it. I think many would say, and rightly so, yes, slavery ended, but discrimination, exclusion continued. So the injustice changes forms, but it's ongoing and continuous. And I think there's a lot of merit to this. The problem is that, again, when we look at how progressives look at their own politics, they never see their own implication in the most heinous regimes as also part of ongoing injustice. They're constantly drawing a clean line. Oh, that wasn't the real socialism. Oh, well, we don't support Stalin anymore. Oh, well, we don't support Mao anymore, right? We broke with that. That's the problem. How is it that it's so easy for progressives to break with Mao, not to see any ongoing injustice in which they are directly and massively implicated, whereas all the rest of us are still directly and massively implicated in histories of Western injustice? So I don't deny any of this Western injustice. I do believe that, yes, that something like slavery, to use your example, left a gross and ongoing legacy, and so did the Soviet Union, and so did the Cultural Revolution, and so did Pol Pot. But where do we see that engagement? Well,
Mhm.
why is it that the progressives who are teaching us to do critical self-scrutiny are always just making clean breaks with their own past? In other words,
Well,
either we all get clean breaks or none of us do.
so
But
that's
it's
an
still,
interesting point.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
this has often been said about the left, is that
yeah.
there's a quip I heard somebody say, which I thought captured it exactly, which is that the right is always judged on its results, and the left is only judged on its intentions. So, as you say, whatever disasters the left produced in the past, you're not supposed to count that against them, because they come up with this excuse that, oh, but that was not real socialism, they didn't try it right, whatever, etc. But I want to make a point about this, because it seems to me that not only is the left bad about recognizing where it has gone wrong in the past, they also have a lot of trouble recognizing what they're doing now. So the left is supposed to be very upset about racism, for example, but nobody's a bigger racist today than the progressives, in my view. So the progressives now have taken the view not only that the West is always wrong and always bad, but that white male heterosexuals are all bad people. That's how they talk. And if you think that, they even say that whiteness is a bad thing, they've been talking like that. So people like Robin DiAngelo and all these critical race theory peddlers and so forth, uh, they have become racists, anti-white racists, and they seem to think that's okay. They seem to think that if you're attacking white people, that's okay. That's not racism. They seem to think that that's anti-racism. So I see a difficulty in not only in examining the past, but in reasoning about their present.
Well, let me try another example. Okay, because yeah, I guess the thing about the sort of obsession with straight white males. I think my concern there would be more about how productive it is than how principled it is. But let me try another example, right? Particularly since you'll obviously have some familiarity with Latin America, right? I mean, over the last what, 15 years, however long it's been, as we know, the Palestinian cause has been a paramount one. One of the most important points which is raised, is the creation of 600,000 to 700,000 Palestinians, who were chased from their homes. Now, again, this has to be taken seriously.
Who chased them?
One moment. Let me just kind of draw out the point here, okay? So again, without getting into the numbers and the details there, let's just assume they believe this. They believe this, okay? So let's see what follows from this belief, because during this exact same period of a decade more, there has been massive support for people like Hugo Chavez, who created 10 times that many. 10 times that many, right? More than 7 million people have had to flee Venezuela during a time when Chavez, then Maduro, when this regime was getting unwavering support, or sometimes goes a bit silent. But how could it be that at the very moment, even assuming every fact to be true, and fine, I'm glad if you want to debate that, but let's just assume this, the facts to be entirely correct about the Palestinians in 1948. How is it that how is it possible that you can be advocating for that? At the same time, you're supporting a regime which is, as you say, in the very present. That's the analogy I wanted to draw to your point. In the very present, you're supporting a regime which has created 10 times that many. Where are those demonstrations? Where is that critical theory? Where is the inquiry into how have our concepts and our allegiances led to this? Right?
So,
I mean, getting back to this kind of purity narrative about it wasn't the real socialism, it wasn't the real, right, and so forth, right? Can you imagine, or getting back also to your point about slavery, if one were to say, oh, well, that wasn't the real liberal democracy, which it wasn't, by the way, but that doesn't become a reason not to study slavery. So why on earth would the fact that the Soviet Union didn't reach a certain cherished ideal be a reason not to study the left's implication in that? So
So
that's
that
more
that
my
actually,
my approach is very much my approach is not so much to bicker about what they're doing, but to actually draw conclusions that they're not drawing. Let's assume that everything they say that is right. I think still there are incredible problems of bad faith, incredible problems essentially of dishonesty about what collective self-criticism is, who has to do it, and why. So,
okay,
I'm willing to accept all the premises.
I'd like to stand on that point to pivot to the topic of anti-Semitism, because it seems to me
Yeah.
that the left only pretends to be upset about oppression. That's the impression I've been getting. So they only pretend. Of course, to say that you're a leftist means that you claim to fight oppression. That's the one thing that all of the people who attach the label leftist to themselves have in common, because they've changed a lot. But what is consistent across the decades is that whoever says I'm a leftist, what that means is that they're claiming to fight oppression. But I don't see today's leftists worried about the fact that Qatar has some 2 million slaves, nor are they worried about the fact that, as you say, Chavez and Maduro have been tremendously oppressive against the ordinary Venezuelans. You don't see them particularly worried about the leftist government in Mexico. So it seems to me that they're just anti-Semites. In other words, the only people that they come out and support are the people that, if they turn them into their pet cause, then they get to attack the Jews. So they make a lot of noise about the Palestinians because raising the Palestinian flag is a way to attack the Jews, particularly the Israeli Jews. But now we're seeing this all over the world. But they don't defend the slaves in Qatar. They don't come out into the streets to protest the murder of I don't know how many Syrians. Whenever it's Arabs killing another Arabs, they don't care. It's only when adopting a cause allows them to attack the Jews that they become very exercised, and suddenly they're very worried about oppression and all kinds of injustice and so forth.
Yeah, okay, and here again, I'll give you my own take, right? Because, right, what I'm trying to, and there's obviously, no matter how engaged, nobody can stand up for every injustice. Obviously, we all have to choose. And so, again, my approach is, I'm not going to bicker. I'm going to assume all of your premises. I'm going to assume all of them. So let's take this example, yeah? Let's just assume, right? If we look at the anti-Israel demonstrations of the past few years, right, particularly since October 7th, 2023, let's assume, okay, basically the story that right, Israel is a colonial state, that Israel is a racist state and its foundations and so forth, right? And right, anybody who reads this literature knows that this is not even up for discussion anymore. This is presented not simply as conjecture or as hypothesis or as possibility, but this is just fact. I mean, really, you see this in the peer-reviewed journals that, right, Israeli colonialism, Israeli racism, and it just goes on to then do the analysis, right? So let's just assume those premises, right? So that's a historical framing, right? We can only understand the Palestinian plight from this historical framing of colonialism and racism. Well, okay, maybe, so even if we assume those premises, why is 50% of this history still missing, right? Again, what about 100 years of, leftists at the very least lending legitimacy, but then often zealous support and in mass numbers to a regime such as that in the Kremlin, which was massively pumping anti-Semitism into the Middle East, massively arming enemies whose governments it largely, helped to construct as oppressive dictatorships in the way that you just mentioned, oppressive of their own people, right? How was this not part of that history?
But that's my
so if I go to these encampments where they're telling me how much I have to understand history, right? And how ignorant I am if I don't do that. Why are they only telling us 50% of the history, even assuming that 50% to be true? And as we know, that's not necessarily even the case. But even if we assume it, who again are these people telling all the rest of us we need to collectively self-scrutinize, right? When this is something that, and this is the argument in my book, they fundamentally have never done. They do strategizing. They say, oh, how do we fix our message? Strategizing is not collective self-scrutiny, and they've always known this for the rest.
I think you're supporting my basic point, which is that it doesn't seem to be true that they honestly care about oppression. I mean, maybe they think they're being honest, but their behavior does not suggest that, because they only raise the I'm fighting oppression flag when it serves the purpose of attacking Jews. So they don't complain about the oppression of the Venezuelans. They don't complain about the oppression of the Russians under Soviet dictatorship. You never hear them really complaining about North Korea, which is an absolutely nightmare state. It's almost like North Korea doesn't exist. Nobody's protesting North Korea.
Which comes out of a leftist history. Right?
Of course. Of course. You don't see them very exercised about it. What about the claim that these people are just anti-Semites? They're just anti-Semites.
Okay, I think I just lost your volume for a minute, but anyway, can you hear me still?
I can hear you. So my question is, what about the interpretation that these people are just anti-Semites and they're dressing their anti-Semitism in the language of the left, but they're simply anti-Semites. It's all they are. They don't care about oppression at all.
Well, again, one of the things I really want to do, there is a real problem with the fact that, again, one of the most important elements of progressive thought going, really pretty much since Karl Marx, is that fundamentally, as you were saying, politics is not fundamentally about intent, it's fundamentally about effect. And so I do believe that most of these people in these encampments and so forth and BDS, I think in their intention, because I know many of them, right? In the depths of their heart, they don't believe that they foster a hatred, right? And then there's all of a sudden we come to a kind of a pre-leftist, a pre-critical theory notion, of what anti-Semitism is, right? It's all of a sudden, it's this kind of classical high humanism about what matters is the feeling in your heart. I don't feel anti-Semitism in my heart, and therefore I cannot be an anti-Semite. And there's all the critical theory goes out the window. 200 years of leftist thought go out the window when it was suddenly about effect and not about intent. So if I don't feel it in my heart, it cannot be. Right, but whereas we've been taught now for decades, right? Critical race theory, for example, is that it's not about intent. Is that you can have all the right laws in place, and you can have people genuinely thinking they're not racist, and yet, if we look at actual patterns, right, we see discrepancies that cannot be explained in any other way, such as all massive attacks on Jews, which have augmented since the 7th of October, right? All of a sudden, nobody's responsible because anti-Semitism was not in their heart. So yeah, I do think that this is part of the problem of failing to do collective self-scrutiny on the left. As you were saying, we get this discrepancy where the standard for some people is intent, right? The standard for us is intent, and the standard for everybody else, the rest of you, is effect. And obviously,
okay, but what do you think? What do you think of this argument that we can present to leftists? Look, if the only time you complain about oppression or alleged oppression is when it is useful to attack the state of Israel or Jews, then you're an anti-Semite. That's the demonstration that you're an anti-Semite.
Well,
hold on, Eric. Yoel, I'm hearing a lot of noise. Is that something we can fix?
Yes, I'm hearing too. Um, I don't know where be the problem.
Well, stop speaking and let's see if we can still hear it. No, it only happens when we speak. It seems to be a kind of an echo or something.
Eric, try to speak.
Yes, I'm still here. I'm listening.
Okay, I think
How was that?
it's solved. I don't know how and
You think
why.
it's solved? Okay. Back to you, Eric. So react to this. My claim is, if the only time leftists complain about oppression is when it is useful to ruin the prestige of Israel or to blame Jews, then they're anti-Semites.
Well, I guess the problem here is that that's a very big if. Certainly that has been the focus in the past few years. Most leftists will start naming, right? If you bring these accusations, most of them will start naming, various other causes in which they're involved, right? So for example, in Britain, they'll tell you, wait, no, that's not all we do. We're very, involved in, certain workers' rights and such other things. And for the most part, that's true. I don't think, Israel, is the only thing that they worry about. But again, I don't think that matters. I just don't think that matters. I think
No, I think it does. So look, I agree that obviously I'm presenting this in an extreme form because it's easier to see what I'm saying. Yes, I agree with you. There are some other issues that they lightly touch, but that's my point. They lightly touch them. The thing that makes them come out into the street in strength is not the fact that there are 2 million slaves in Qatar. They don't care about them. I've never seen them protest about that. I have a whole article on this. The slaves in Qatar. Okay, so if you're a leftist, there is no greater oppression than producing slaves. And the slaves in Qatar are not metaphorical slaves. They have an owner. They can't leave the country. They don't get paid. They're abused physically and sexually. These are literal chattel slaves. So you'd think for leftists, that's absolutely the most offensive thing imaginable. They don't care. Nobody's protesting the slaves in Qatar. And I'll give you a statistic that is really amazing. The UN has more resolutions against the state of Israel for alleged violations of human rights than resolutions against all other states combined. Meanwhile, Qatar doesn't have a single UN resolution for violations of human rights. This is obviously anti-Semitism. And the left loves the UN. So the left is always invoking the authority of the UN for everything they want to do. They love the UN. Well, the UN behaves like an anti-Semitic club.
Well, yeah. I mean, what was curious is that, the UN was nothing but.
Yes?
Okay, yeah. Sorry, I lost you for a minute there, I think.
Oh,
I see your
right
lips
here.
moving, but I don't hear it.
Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I mean, what's curious is that if you go back about 2 decades to the invasion of Iraq, right, which there all of a sudden the United Nations was nothing a puppet of the United States, and so so obviously, and this is not unusual for these big international organizations that when they're doing what you want, they're.
Well, I'm not saying that. Hold on. I'm not saying that the UN is not very influenced by the United States. I never denied that. But I don't think the United States is pro-Jewish at all. I think that's consistent. It's consistent that the U.S. Bosses have a huge influence on the UN and the fact that the UN behaves like an anti-Semitic club. I think both things are consistent. Look, let's not forget that the U.S. campaigned for Kurt Waldheim to become Secretary General of the UN, and they campaigned 3 times for him. He had 2 terms, And when he finished his second term, the U.S. was very keen on giving him a third term. And Kurt Waldheim was a Nazi. And he is the one who brought PLO chairman Yasser Arafat to give a speech at the UN and to induct the PLO as an observer member, and so forth. That was all done by Kurt Waldheim, the Nazi, who was the preferred Secretary General for the U.S. bosses. So it seems to me there's no contradiction in saying that there's a lot of U.S. influence on the UN, and that the UN is basically an anti-Semitic club. Your reaction?
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, I agree with you that strictly speaking, there's no contradiction there. Yeah, and the way the voting blocks work at the United Nations, indeed, has led to this kind of result. Whereas you say Israel has had more resolutions against it than all other nations combined.
Which is absurd.
And in many ways, I guess, the fundamental problem here is that, and I don't think international lawyers really deal with this very well. I think they kind of skirt around it as an embarrassment, which is that you can't run an institution as fundamentally democratic when massive quantities of its membership don't believe in democracy at all, right? I mean,
they're Muslim states. It's a Muslim club, basically.
Well, so, I mean, many, yeah, and so this is this has always been a problem with the United Nations. And again, I think most international lawyers, they'll kind of drop their heads and they'll kind of say, well, it's the best we have, and that's the world we live in, and so forth. But then we have to be quite honest about these sometimes rather appalling results.
But if the international lawyers are skirting around the issue that the UN behaves like an anti-Semitic club, why can't we say that those international lawyers are anti-Semites themselves? Why can't we call a spade a spade?
Well, I mean,
Why can't we call anti-Semites?
I haven't taken any sort of. I haven't taken any public position, for example, against the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs. It doesn't mean that I'm complicit in it or approve of it. I just haven't kind of gotten around to it, basically. And I could multiply this with many human rights abuses, right? So we can't.
Oh no, I understand. I understand that you can't be taking up all the causes in the world, but literally there are no street protests for the slaves in Qatar. There are no street protests for the Uyghurs. There are no street protests for the 500,000 Syrians who have been killed in the Syrian civil war. No street protests for the people who die in Sudan. And nothing. The people come out into the streets to protest supposedly in favor of the Arab Palestinians, which in practice becomes protests in favor of Hamas. And these are not, I mean, look, the historical facts are that Israel had evacuated Gaza in 2005. Those people were being left alone. It's just that they started firing rockets on Israeli cities. So Israel had to do something about it. But you don't see people taking up the easy causes. They take up the hardest cause in the world. There is no more difficult cause to take up as a leftist than to defend genocidal jihadists. And yet that's what they're doing. And there are many worthy causes around the world that don't make them come out into the streets. So it seems to me the simple answer is that they are anti-Semites. The left has become anti-Semitic. They hate the Jews. And so they only take up the cause that allows them to construct a false argument against the Jews, but it's one that works in the media and in academia, because basically professors at universities all over the West are anti-Semites. You may not know my own personal history, but when I was working at the University of Pennsylvania, I started researching the Arab-Israeli conflict because I have an abiding interest in racism. And I was working in the psychology department, but I was also a research fellow at a think tank that they had created there to study ethno-political conflict. And when I started studying the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, I very quickly, with documents that we had in the library, because this is not exactly a secret, it's just that nobody discusses it, I learned that the people who put together the organization that pretends to speak for the Arab Palestinians, which is the PLO, or rather Fatah, which is the controlling core of the PLO, they were Nazis. They were German Nazis. So Haj Amin al-Husseini, the founder of Fatah and also the founder of the Arab Palestinian movement, he was running the death camps for Adolf Hitler in World War II. This was established at the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal with the testimony of Adolf Eichmann's right-hand man, Dieter Wislicenyi. There were three testimonies, that one from Rudolf Kastner, another one from Andreas Steiner, and both of those testimonies, independent, corroborated by Dieter Wislicenyi, who was a very careful witness before he was himself executed after the war. So the creator of the organization that was introduced into Israel, the creator of Al-Fatah, which swallowed the PLO, was himself a leader of the German Nazi final solution. And when I documented this, well, I didn't document it for the first time. When I learned about this, studying about this thing in the library and on the internet, and I wrote an article with all of the documentation of the history of the Arab-Palestinian movement, the University of Pennsylvania fired me. They never challenged my documentation. To the contrary, they said that my documentation was impeccable, but that this stuff couldn't be said. So the university structure in the West is deeply anti-Semitic. That's what that experience taught me. The media is deeply anti-Semitic. They're always attacking Israel for all kinds of things, but they never attack Qatar. You don't see the media complaining about 2 million slaves in Qatar. They complain about Israel. And of course, the media is left-leaning. So the left orientation of the media is influencing the leftists all around the West. And the result is that they're all attacking Israel, but they don't seem worried about true oppression happening in many other places. Would you disagree that your fellow professors at the University of London are anti-Semites? For the most part?
Well, I mean, yeah, again, it's, it's, so, okay, sorry, I think there's just a bit of a delay in the visual and hopefully you can hear me.
I can
and here again, I think we get, okay, I think we get back to this problem of intent and effect, right? One of the core precepts, as I'm sure you know, for example, of critical race theory, right, is that we're all complicit, right? This gets back to the points you were making before about the concept of whiteness, right? We're all complicit in it, regardless of our intention. And so, yes, I think a real question arises about unintentional complicity and anti-Semitism, right?
But the left doesn't complain about that.
No. Well, of course, nobody complains about their own racism. That's the problem, right? And this brings me back to my point about collective self-criticism, right? If collective self-criticism is for everyone else, then it's just a silly doctrine.
Yes, good point. Now let's pivot to Russian anti-Semitism, because you've defended the view that Russia has been especially important as a fountain and motor for anti-Semitism over the years historically. So tell us a little bit about that. Why do you hold this view?
Well, yeah, and there's a long history. Again, I mean, this goes back to the Tsarist period, right, when the protocols of the Elders of Zion period, of the pogroms, as we know, was a Tsarist creation. Right, I mean, as the basic history goes, immediately after World War II, the Kremlin was tentatively supportive of the state of Israel, which it saw as possibly opening up a new front against the West. But this shifted very quickly. Once Israel kind of established itself more in the Western camp, then massively the Soviet Union saw some rich terrain, some fertile soil, all throughout the Arab world. And right, and as I was saying before, not only massively armed countries and massively supported the creation of very dictatorial regimes, sometimes loosely resembling the Soviet model of mutual harm and that sort of thing, but also little by little, all of a sudden, the protocols of the Elders of Zion had been translated into Arabic and were available on every street corner, right? Not to mention things like radio broadcasts and so forth, television, and yeah, I mean, one of the bits of information that I find very interesting are the revelations of one of the top officers of the Romanian secret police who had escaped to the West, Jan Pacepa. And he, right, because there was always this sort of standard idea that Romania had kind of gone its own way, that it had nothing to do with the Kremlin. Of course, there's a lot, I think, to suggest the case. It was rather a front, right, just to kind of make the East Bloc look, look like it wasn't completely controlled from the Kremlin. And what was fascinating here was that Pacepa talked about how he and Yuri Andropov, again, who at the time was the head of the KGB, later on came to be Secretary General, right, after the death of Brezhnev. And right, so these are two very senior people. And right, and he basically wrote about how he and Andropov cooperated in essentially, just dumping it, right? Basically, they saw Arabs as stupid, as the Arab, again, they saw this, right? Right, again, we hear a lot about Western Orientalism. We don't hear about this version that the left itself was actually supporting, right? So they basically saw the Arabs.
I think the left.
I'll just finish the story, yeah, because I'm almost done, right? Which is that, right, so they saw Arabs as massively stupid and therefore as fertile ground, as likely to be very receptive to anti-Semitism. And yeah, sure enough, so they really orchestrated a campaign of disseminating anti-Semitism throughout the Middle East, right? Because there had been all sorts of, interethnic conflicts. It was never only with Jews, but all of a sudden that became the focal one. And this is where the time where we really start getting the narratives of Zionism is racism. This was another one of their pet projects, right? The 1975 United Nations resolution, the idea of, Israel as, as just another colonial power in the model of, British or French colonialism.
South Africa, compared it to South African apartheid.
Yeah. Yeah, and so yeah, no, I mean, I do think there's a long history, and and it continued. Putin. What's really interesting about the Russian, one of the things I've briefly done, was to compare Russian anti-Semitism with Nazi anti-Semitism, right? Because usually, if you ask people, what's the number one purveyor of anti-Semitism in world history, it would be Nazi Germany. And one of the things I say is actually not really. Certainly they did plenty of it, right? But the period of Nazi anti-Semitism was hideous, but it was a rather constrained period of time. The Russian anti-Semitism just stretches out for over a century. Again, it started with Tsarism, and it almost never stopped. It ebbed and flowed. It was a much more imperial type. The Nazi anti-Semitism wasn't a particularly imperial type in the same way. The Russian anti-Semitism is a kind of old-style imperialistic anti-Semitism. In other words, we're just going to use it strategically. And so it was consistent. So Russian anti-Semitism has always been consistent with the fact that, yeah, you can still have Jews in Russia, and sometimes, they might teach at universities or be doctors or lawyers, right? Because it's a very different kind of anti-Semitism. So it's more diffuse, it's more strategic, it's more, where is this going to kind of help us to achieve certain ends? But when they saw ends that could be achieved, yeah, it was massively deployed. And I think it just had a much more global influence. Because again, all of these narratives, about Israel being, no different from, say, French or British or Dutch or colonialism, right? Again, this was massively adopted on the left. Basically, the Soviet narrative has continued almost unchanged.
I would like to suggest that the phenomenon is actually more broadly Western, because Russian anti-Semitism actually had an important injection from French anti-Semitism, because the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is actually a plagiarized text from a French book that had nothing to do with Jews, which is Maurice Joly's Dialogue in Hell between Machiavelli and Montesquieu. And it was the great French anti-Semite, Edouard Drumont, who took that book to the Okhrana, so that the Okhrana is the secret police of the Tsar, so that they could use that to create the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And the French anti-Semitic movement was gigantic and very influential, and of course that explains why the top crust of French bureaucracy, in fact, collaborated with the Nazis and sent all the French Jews to die in Auschwitz. And we also have an important contribution, I would say a critical contribution, from British anti-Semitism and US anti-Semitism. So when we talk about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, we have to factor in that the American eugenicists were spending fortunes, particularly Henry Ford, getting everybody to read the Protocols of Zion, and the great financiers of eugenics. I don't know if you've read Edwin Black's great history of eugenics, but the great financiers of eugenics were in the United States and Great Britain. So people like John D. Rockefeller and the Carnegie Foundation and the Ford Foundation, and other people like the Harrimans and what's his name, Thomas Watson of IBM and so forth. These people were pushing the eugenics movement, and they were spending a lot of money to grow German eugenics, which became Nazism. So there's a huge contribution. And then almost the entire British ruling class was pro-Nazi. This has been very well documented. It wasn't just Edward VIII who abdicated to marry a British spy and then had his honeymoon over there with Hitler, doing the Nazi salute with the troops parading in front. And it wasn't just Edward VIII. There was an enormous amount of support for Nazism and the Nazi Party in the British aristocracy. And actually, you might be interested in a short article that I published on our website. I'll send it to you, where I show people that in the best, most prestigious history journals of Oxford and Cambridge in the 1980s, perfectly mainstream historians documented beyond any shadow of a doubt that Chamberlain was a Nazi. He was not an appeaser. His ideology was German Nazism. It was established in the 1980s, but somehow it hasn't trickled down into the textbooks. People are still talking about Neville Chamberlain as if he had been an appeaser. The interpretation that Churchill defended in his History of the War, that Chamberlain was trying to preserve the peace, and he was a coward and an idiot, and so on and so forth, is still being peddled to students in schools all across the West, when in fact it was documented in the 1980s that Chamberlain had in secret corrupted all of the British press through his best friend Joseph Ball, Sir Joseph Ball, who was a creature of the intelligence services in Great Britain. And he was using the press to raise the prestige of Hitler's foreign policy, raise the prestige of his own policy of supposed appeasement. And in fact, the interpretation that emerges from all this work is that Chamberlain was assisting the German Nazi conquest of Europe quite consciously. The smoking gun here is the newspaper Truth, which no longer exists. It ceased exist. I think it ceased circulating in 1957, I believe. But Truth was a British newspaper that Neville Chamberlain fully owned through what do you call them? Through how do we say this in English? When somebody lends you their name so that nobody knows that you were the guy. Anyways, Joseph Ball had bought the paper. It was totally controlled by Chamberlain and Ball, and Truth was rabidly anti-Semitic. It was always defending Adolf Hitler's foreign policy, and it even lionized Hitler as a supposedly great watercolor artist. And that was the newspaper that Chamberlain directly controlled. So I think we have to expand our understanding of what produces anti-Semitism well beyond Russia, although I agree with you that Russia has been very, very important.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, I guess I think Russian anti-Semitism has been the most effective. But, I mean, it's not a contest, right? It's not, so I don't have a stake in whether it's, who comes in first and second and third. I just think that, yeah, I just think particularly if we want to, again, get back to what's really been going on in the Middle East, I do think that, particularly after the end of the Cold War, we end up with these ridiculous, oh, well, that's over now. So, that's done, right? Which is you don't know whether that's ridiculous or irrelevant, but it's certainly one of those.
Well, I certainly find it interesting that the Soviet Union became very rapidly anti-Semitic in the post-war and a big enemy of the state of Israel when Israel was a radically leftist state in the whole first period after the Great War. And they were even trying collectivization. It's the only country that tried out collectivization without coercion. The only place where that happened was Israel. So you would think that Israel would have been the darling of the Soviets. But instead, the Soviets supported states that were quite obviously fascist states, the Arab states. And what I think makes sense of that is that the people who are always promoting anti-Semitism and are always attacking the Jews are the totalitarians. Whether they are totalitarians of the left or of the right seems to be immaterial. The people who want to enslave everybody are always attacking the Jews. And also on our website, we have an analysis that goes back 4,300 years to Sargon of Akkad, because what you see in the ancient history of Mesopotamia, you see a movement there to extend. You're interested in human rights. I think you'll be interested in this because in great antiquity in Mesopotamia, there was a movement to extend legal human rights to practically everybody. They were progressively abolishing slavery there. It was a culture that lasted for 2,000 years. As I said, this is a movement that was started by Sargon of Akkad in his revolution 4,300 years ago. And it was attacked all this time. It was attacked by totalitarian movements and empires, like, for example, the Assyrians, who were absolute terrorists. So the Babylonian Semitism was fighting Assyrian anti-Semitism, and then the contest, once the Persian Empire was destroyed by the Greek anti-Semites, the contest became one between the Jews, who are the most sophisticated product of Babylonian Semitism, and the Greco-Romans, who were absolute fascists in the Mediterranean. And once the Jews settled all over the Mediterranean, you had this tremendous confrontation between the ethics of Judaism and the anti-ethics of Greeks and Romans. And what I think is happening now is what has been happening now for 2,500 years in the West, which is that you have totalitarian ruling elites that sometimes pretend to be Judeo-Christian Democrats when it's convenient for them, as they do sometimes today. But when they don't need to dissimulate, they become obvious fascists. And those ruling elites, those totalitarian ruling elites, have been fighting against the influence of Jewish ethics and Jewish political thought and philosophy all this time. And so what we're seeing today, if you really take the correlation seriously, what we're seeing today is just one more instance of totalitarian ideologies organizing propaganda in the West so that people will start hating the Jews and moving in the direction of another Holocaust.
Let's hope this doesn't happen.
Yes, let's hope it doesn't happen. But there definitely seems to be a structural regularity there. So I think we need to take that seriously, and I'd love your reaction to that. So I'll send you the documentation. I'd love for you to take a look at it, because I think this is a central question of Western human rights. When people go to school in the West, or even when they go to the university, which is where they're supposedly getting the best information, what they learn is that the modern conception of law and liberty and government and so on and so forth that we cherish in the West, that supposedly all came from the Greeks. And this is what I learned in school. It's what everybody learns in school. It's what professors talk about at the universities, and it's false. The Greeks were oppressing everybody. They had oceans of slaves. The Romans were very similar. The Romans actually thought that, it was fun to watch lions eat people right in front of them in the Colosseum. They were psychopaths. We didn't get our notions of human rights from them. We didn't learn democracy from them. We learned human rights and democracy from the Jews, from the Jewish idea that we're all equal under the law because we're all equally children of God, right? So I find it very interesting that people who control education in the West have made a very, very big investment to convince us to admire the Greeks as the supposed fountain of everything we cherish in the West, when in fact we got it from the Jews. And if the educational establishment were teaching us that Jewish influence is what taught us how to fight for liberty and for our human rights, whether directly from the Jews or through Jewish ethics that were adopted in Christianity, we would have transcended anti-Semitism a long time ago. It would have dawned on Westerners that the way to defend their own freedoms and to ensure the continuation of their own democracies is to make sure that the Jews are safe. Because every time that the totalitarian anti-Semites organize mass killings of Jews, that's the canary in the coal mine. They're all about to be enslaved. The Goyim are all about to be enslaved. We see it with the German Nazis, right? The German Nazis enslaved everybody in Europe. The Russian boyars, who also organized mass killings of Jews, were enslaving everybody in the Russian Empire. The Catholic inquisitors were enslaving everybody in Europe. Even the Catholics couldn't think freely. They couldn't disagree with the Pope because they would be burned alive. You go further back, you got the Romans, you got the Greco-Macedonians. they were also running slave states, and they were also organizing mass killings of Jews. The Romans had a huge genocide in the 1st and 2nd centuries. And the Greco-Macedonians also the genocide, which the Jews remember in Hanukkah. So the correlation is perfect. Every time totalitarian organizing mass killings of Jews, they're about to enslave everybody else. So to me that there is something very curiously suspicious in the structure of Western education, that we are always being taught to admire the ancient fascists and never the culture that is the fountain of ideas that eventually produced Western democracy. What do you think about that?
Well, it's quite a lot there to unpack. Right? I'm right. I mean, I have to confess here, I'm also one of these people who teaches ancient Greek philosophy, and certainly not. Although I certainly never tell my students that they should admire it. That's up to them what they want to admire. And we certainly talk about slavery, subordination of women, oligarchical structures, and so forth. So the point, the aim is certainly not to tie it all up with a pretty ribbon and present it as as a kind of as a beautiful museum piece. The point is to promote critical thinking. And so I would hope, I mean, in the spirits of Socrates himself, that this would be the only way that anything is taught, to promote critical thinking, and not simply to promote admiration of anything. That's for people to do on their own time.
All right, so then allow me to suggest that when you teach the Greeks to your students to promote critical thinking, you should ask them the question, and allow them to explore it. Which hypothesis is more consistent with the historical evidence? That we got democracy from the Greeks, or that we got it from the Jews? I think this is a really interesting question that would promote a lot of critical thinking among university students. And then they can discuss it, they can have their debates. It might even be interesting to have like a mock trial, and have people be responsible for defending the pro-Greek view, and then people responsible for defending the pro-Jewish view, and see how well they do. And I think that the exchange would be extremely educational for everybody.
Okay, I've taken note of your suggestion.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to leave you with that suggestion, because we are now 1 hour into our conversation and we have to go. But I want to thank you on behalf of everybody at Management of Reality and our audience for coming to talk to us. You're an interesting man, and we appreciate your time, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk again.
Well, thank you very, very much for having me. It's been very interesting for me too.
Thank you, Eric. And I will be sending you some materials, and I hope we can you can react to them, and we can continue the conversation in written form.
All right then. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good